Welcome dear friends to yet another lecture on Critical Studies 2, a syllabus prescribed for MA students of Kerala University. In our lecture today, we shall begin our discussion of New Historicism. Now, it is a second module of our syllabus and we shall have a general introduction about New Historicism in this short lecture today. New Historicism. We are all familiar with Historicism. We have heard that word, Historicism. Now, Historicism began by the end of the 18th century. Historicism views literary texts as integrally informed by their historical milieu. So, literary texts are integrally informed by the historical factors. Literature and history are core texts. Literature as the reflection of a particular age's shared worldview, etc. That is Historicism. Now, Historicism is the idea of attributing significance to elements of space and time, such as historical period, geographical place, local culture, etc. So, in order to contextualize theories, narratives and other interpretative instruments, we use Historicism. Now, all systems of thought, all phenomena, all institutions, all works of art and all literary texts must be situated in a historical perspective. Institutions, works of art, literary texts, etc. they belong to a historical period. Texts or any phenomena cannot be analyzed in isolation outside of a historical process. Literature must be read in the broad context of culture, economics and other discourses ranging from politics, religion, aesthetics, etc. So, Historicism. Now, they are determined in form and content by the specific historical circumstances. All that I have said, even the literary text is conditioned by the specific historical circumstances, their specific situation in time and place. The form and content of the text is decided by the context, situation, history. Now, this is Historicism. Thus, the earlier scholars treated the social intellectual history as a background against which a literary work is set, a background. It viewed literature as a reflection of the characteristics of the period. So, this is the understanding that we have about Historicism. The historical factors form a background for literary texts. Now, what is New Historicism? New Historicism is a critical movement that flourished in the 1870s and 80s. New Historicism is based on the premise that a literary work should be considered as the product of historical and cultural conditions of its production and interpretation, rather than the isolated creation of a genius. Now, the new historicist understands a work through its historical and cultural context and understands the cultural and intellectual history through literature. Thus, it is a two-way process. The literary text is understood in terms of the historical and cultural context. On the other way, the historical and cultural context is understood from the literature of the time. So, it is a two-way process. The new historicists begin their analysis of literary text by attempting to look at what the other texts means both literary and non-literary texts, a public could access at the time of writing a particular text, what the author of the original text might have read. So, all the literary and non-literary texts are quite important for the new historicists. They try to relate the text to the political and social economic circumstances in which they actually originated. In beginning theory, Peter Barry would state that New Historicism is a method based on parallel reading of literary and non-literary texts. So, the earlier historicists considered the historical cultural context as a background to literary text, but today New Historicism considers a parallel reading of both literary and non-literary texts. The term New Historicism was coined by Stephen Greenblatt in his work Renaissance Self-Fashioning from Moore to Shakespeare in 1980. So it is Stephen Greenblatt who coined this particular term, New Historicism. Now, New Historicism also is influenced by many authors like Louis Althusser, Michel Foucault, Mikhail Bakhtin, and Clifford Geertz, etc. Now, we are familiar with all these authors. Louis Althusser, for example, we are familiar with his concept of ideology or ideological state apparatus. Ideology manifests in different ways in every discourses, also through literature. So this ideology is used to subject and to subordinate the subjects to the interests of the ruling class. So Louis Althusser. We are familiar with Michel Foucault. The discourses of the era bring into being the concepts, oppositions, and hierarchies of what it speaks. The discursive formation of the era determines what knowledge is, what truth is, what is normal and what is criminal. So that is what Michel Foucault would say. The discourses of the era is important. Mikhail Bakhtin would state that the text incorporates a number of conflicting voices that represent diverse social classes and interests. So New Historicism should look into these conflicting voices that are in the literary and non-literary texts. Another important author who influences New Historicism is Clifford Geertz. According to him, culture is constituted by distinctive sets of signifying systems, and he would propose the concept of thick descriptions. Now, what is thick descriptions? The close analysis or reading of a particular social production or a particular social event so as to recover the meaning it has for the people involved in it, and to discover within the overall cultural system the new network of conventions, codes, and modes of thinking with which the particular item is implicated. Now, thick description means unearthing the underlying meaningful structures of local events, the meaningful structures of local interactions, and from those interactions generalize the whole societies. The influential writings of Geertz are the interpretation of cultures, selected essays of which he published in 1973, local knowledge, further essays in interpretive anthropology which he published in 1983, etc. According to Geertz, the description of the real world also is fiction. Texts are wrought and crafted. The ethnographer collects data and shapes the ethnographic fiction. The critics arrange, comment, and ironize. So that is Clifford Geertz. So my dear students, in New Historicism, there is the fusion of two things. The fusion of the linguistic turn of the post-structural and deconstructive criticism, and the return of historical reading. So it is a fusion of two things. The fusion of two things is summarized by Louis Monroe in his statement, historicity of text and the textuality of history. So Louis Monroe would summarize it as the historicity of text and the textuality of history. Now, historicity of text is the analysis of the text based on the history, and textuality of history is how history is documented. So, historicity of text and textuality of history. In New Historicism, both these are combined. There are literary texts that contain history, and history is represented in text. Thus, literary and non-literary texts are considered for analysis. So it's a parallel reading wherein the literary and non-literary texts are considered for analysis. In a standard New Historicist essay, there is no complete reading of the text. The strategy used is to link together a series of apparently unrelated items. Now, from these reading, the New Historicist will generalize the working of the society. The New Historicism looked for more dynamic relation between the text and the societies. So, the text is important, the cultural social condition is important, society is important. So, New Historicism is looking for more dynamic relation between the text and the society. The society formed the text, and the text in turn shaped the society from which they come. So, the text is shaping the society is shaping the text. So, both are important. The New Historicist insists that there is no history in the sense of a narrative of indisputable past events, but there are only our versions, there are only our narratives, or representations of the past. Now, in this view, each stage projects its own preoccupations on the past. So, each stage of interpretation will project its own preoccupation onto the past. Historians may think that they are revealing their own historical situation and their personal preferences. For example, Columbus was presented as a heroic benefactor of mankind who discovered the New World. But Columbus did not discover the New World. The indigenous people were there. It was Columbus who was lost, since he thought he was in India. The people who wrote in 1900s wrote in praise of colonialism, but people who wrote in the 1990s have different views. Now, ancient Greece was projected as the source of democracy and rational thinking, but now it is regarded as a society that was built on slavery and the oppression of women. So, Renaissance was glorified as an age of enlightenment thought, but is often seen as an age that tyrannized women, enslaved colonial people, believed in witchcraft and astrology. So, a well-known new historicist will analyze all the traveler's tale, all the geographical works of a time of William Shakespeare to interpret the play The Tempest. So, new historicist reading will involve all the literary as well as non-literary texts of the times. We can say that new historicism is a reaction to formalism and structuralism. Now, formalism is a reaction to historical scholarship. It reduces the text to an autonomous, self-sufficient entity. Structuralism declared the death of the author. Now, new historicism is part of post-structuralist tendency to rehistoricize literary studies. New historicism is a literary theory based on the idea that literature should be studied and interpreted within the context of both the history of the author and the history of the critic. Based on the literary criticism of Stephen Greenblatt and influenced by the philosophy of Michel Foucault, the new historicism acknowledges the following. The new historicism acknowledges the following factors. New historicism would say that a work of literature is influenced by the author's times and the circumstances. So, a work of literature is influenced heavily by the author's times and the circumstances of the author. The critic's response to that work is influenced by the environment of the critic, his beliefs and prejudices. The new historicist looks at literature examining how the writer's times affected the work and how the work reflects the writer's times. He also recognizes that current cultural context colors the critic's conclusion. So, the writer's times, the critic's times, all these are very important in new historicism. Thus, new historicism underscores the impermanence of literary criticism. Nothing is stable. Everything depends upon the interpreter as well, depends upon the critic's times as well. Current literary criticism reveals and is affected by the beliefs of our times. And at the same time, literature reflects and is reflected by its own historical context. So, our understanding of great literature will change as the time changes. Now, new historicism is the reconstruction of the past from present perspective. So, reconstruction of the past from the present perspective. It also highlights the role of the present in remaking the past and making it more usable to the present. The text has historicity, and historicity has a claim to textuality. And that's what we said earlier, the quote of Louis Monroe's, the historicity of text and the textuality of history. Now, new historicism treats works of literature not as a story but as a representation of historical forces. This literary theory considers the social, cultural, historical, economic and political implications of the text. So, my dear students, this was our first lecture on new historicism, and I have said so many ideas regarding this particular concept. It is quite different from the old historicism. The old scholars used to consider the socio-political situation of the literary text as a background only. The literary text was the pearl and the socio-political situation is the cover of the particular pearl. It was only a background to the literary text. But in the new historicism, both the literary and non-literary texts are very important. There is this parallel reading. Both are important. Now, the literary text is influenced by the history and culture of the time of the author, and at the same time, the literary text also influences the culture and history of the author. The literary text influences the critic also, and also the interpretation of the literary text is affected by the historical times and perspective of the critics as well. So, we require a new way of reading a text in which both the literary and the non-literary texts of the times are considered equally. In our subsequent classes, we shall discuss some of the important concepts that are related with the new historicism. Thank you for your patient listening. Please listen to the lecture and take down the important points on new historicism. Please complement your notes with extra reading as well as listening to lectures on new historicism. Thank you. Stay safe at home. Have a nice time. Have a joyful learning.